If you stood on the rain-slicked cobblestones of London in 1840, your senses would be assaulted by the sights and sounds of the British capital. The air was thick with coal smoke, wet horsehair, and mud churned up by iron-rimmed carriage wheels. Now, you have to understand something about this era. Before movies, before television, before TikTok, this was the show. The military was the ultimate public entertainment, and regiments regularly marched through London to project absolute imperial stability. Then came the 11th Light Dragoons. And if you thought the British Army had a reputation for looking intimidating, these guys looked ready for opening night at the theater. As the clatter of hooves echoed down the street, the crowd stopped in pure bewilderment. Moving through the gray London fog was a burst of color that looked almost unreal. The men rode high in their saddles, wearing royal blue jackets layered with gold braid, with fur-trimmed pelisses draped over their shoulders. But it was what lay below the waist that caused a collective gasp from the onlookers. A pair of tight, cherry crimson trousers. Not exactly what you'd expect from Britain's toughest cavalry. To the Victorian public, this wasn't just unusual. It was entirely unprecedented. The standard British cavalryman was a creature of practical blues, deep scarlets, and sturdy dark wool. Crimson trousers of this shade and tightness were unheard of in the history of the king's forces. Almost immediately, the manufactured awe intended by the uniform curdled into mockery, and everyone from street vendors to high society gentlemen alike began to laugh. The newspapers had a field day. Satirical cartoons filled the daily rags, officially dubbing them the cherry pickers, while rival regiments sneered at them as a piece of royal confectionery. Onlookers openly joked that these men looked less like defenders of the British Empire and more like the stars of an extravagant West End stage production. If you love uncovering the sides of history that textbooks completely ignore, you're in the right place. Welcome to Wild History. In Victorian Britain, uniforms weren't just clothes. They were status, discipline, and power stitched into fabric. But these famous trousers were rapidly becoming the symbol of a regiment that was quietly reaching its breaking point. For ordinary enlisted men riding through those mocking crowds, there was no voice, no union, and no avenue for complaint. Enlisted hussars generally came from the working classes, seeking escape from poverty or factory labor. Enlisted soldiers possessed virtually zero systemic power to challenge their superiors, forcing them to endure public humiliation and physical discomfort in silence, as the tension inside the barracks began to grow toxic. To understand how a dispute over clothing became a national scandal, you first have to understand how the British Army actually worked. In the 1840s, Britain did not choose its military leaders based on tactical brilliance or battlefield experience. Instead, rank was a commodity bought and sold on an open market. In Victorian Britain, if you had enough money, you didn't have to earn command. You could literally buy it. The purchase system was designed to ensure that the officer corps remained populated by wealthy gentlemen, men with a financial stake in the stability of the country, who were unlikely to lead a political revolution. Critics, however, argued that this system achieved the exact opposite of security, promoting unearned privilege over basic military competence. There was no greater embodiment of this systemic flaw than Lieutenant Colonel James Brudenell, famously known to history as Lord Cardigan. Imagine buying a football club, then obsessing over the jerseys while ignoring how the team actually plays. That was Cardigan. He possessed a massive personal fortune, an explosive temper, and a belief that his status placed him far above ordinary men. When the command of the 11th Light Dragoons became available, he didn't climb the ranks through merit. He simply wrote a check for £40,000, equivalent to millions today, to buy his way to the top of the regiment. Cardigan seemed to view the regiment less as a battlefield force and more as a showcase of military perfection. Contemporary accounts suggest he believed immaculate uniforms weren't vanity, they were discipline made visible. To Cardigan, a crooked seam seemed almost as offensive as losing a battle. He demanded absolute obedience to that ideal, spending an estimated £10,000 of his own money every single year to completely redesign the uniforms from scratch, creating the crimson trousers. But what Cardigan viewed as a magnificent achievement in discipline transformed into a nightmare for the men forced to live under his command. He practically micromanaged the stitching, turning the daily routine of the barracks into a gauntlet of relentless inspections. Cardigan would spend hours pacing the lines, his piercing eyes searching for the slightest imperfection. If a seam was off by a fraction of an inch, or if a horse's grooming wasn't flawless, the consequences were severe. The tight-fitting crimson trousers themselves became a source of constant physical misery. Tailored closely to present a sleek silhouette, they were widely disliked and uncomfortable during long hours on horseback. Cardigan's tyranny extended far beyond the common soldier. His most intense venom was reserved for his officer corps. He systematically targeted the seasoned, battle-hardened veteran officers under his command, men who had served with genuine distinction in India and actually knew the realities of warfare. Cardigan viewed these experienced men as unpolished and unsuited for his high society regiment, treating them with a sneering, snobbish contempt. Long before the public ever heard of the regiment, Cardigan had earned a terrifying reputation within military circles as an unstable bully. The real soldiers of the 11th Hussars felt their professional honor being systematically stripped away, replaced by an aristocrat's obsession. For months, resentment simmered beneath the polished uniforms. Then something astonishing happened. Out of everything that could have destroyed this regiment, enemy armies, battlefield disasters, political conspiracies, it was a wine bottle. Imagine risking your entire military career because someone served wine in the wrong bottle. The scene unfolded during a formal dinner in the grand candlelit officers' mess hall at the barracks in Brighton. The room was a display of Victorian luxury. Long tables of polished mahogany, silver candelabras casting flickering light, and expensive crystal glassware. Lord Cardigan sat at the head of the table, presiding over the evening with cold arrogance. Further down the table sat Captain John Reynolds. Reynolds was everything Cardigan was not, a respected veteran who had earned his status through years of service in the harsh climates of India, rather than buying it with an inheritance. During the course of the meal, Captain Reynolds ordered a bottle of premium Moselle white wine to share with a guest at his table. When the waiter arrived, he did not pour the wine into one of the expensive crystal decanters that Cardigan had personally mandated for the mess. Instead, he simply placed the wine on the table in its original dark glass bottle. To Lord Cardigan, who was watching from the head of the table, the sight of that dark bottle was an unpardonable sin. In his mind, an unlabeled black bottle sitting on an officer's table looked low class. It looked like common porter beer. It was a visual defilement of the pristine environment he demanded. The room suddenly fell into a dead silence as Cardigan's face twisted in rage. The clinking of silverware stopped. The officers sat frozen, staring into their plates, acutely aware of the volatile temper of their commander. Cardigan did not pull Reynolds aside privately. Instead, he chose to inflict maximum humiliation, flying into a loud rage and publicly reprimanding Reynolds in front of his guests and fellow officers, accusing him of insulting the dignity of the mess. But Captain John Reynolds was a proud officer who had survived real combat, and he had finally reached his limit. He refused to sit in silence and take an unearned beating over the appearance of a wine bottle. He stood his ground, firmly and calmly defending his honor, and stated that he had done nothing wrong. He refused to accept Cardigan's petty reprimand. The defiance sent Cardigan over the edge. The very next morning, a furious Cardigan used his command authority to place Reynolds under close arrest, confining him to his quarters and threatening him with a career-ending court-martial. But Cardigan had severely miscalculated the public mood. Word of the absurd arrest leaked out almost immediately, and the controversy spread quickly through Britain's newspapers. The Daily Rags seized on the story with relish, plastering the details across every front page. The Black Bottle incident instantly transformed from a petty barracks dispute into a national symbol of upper-class tyranny. And somehow, it gets even weirder. If you're hooked on how spectacularly bizarre history can get, make sure you're subscribed to Wild History so you don't miss the next drop. Because right here, Cardigan decides to turn this entire situation up to 11. The public arrest of Captain Reynolds did not spark a Hollywood-style mutiny in the courtyard, but it accomplished something far more dangerous. It shattered the morale of the regiment. At this point, the regiment wasn't fighting Britain's enemies, it was fighting its own commander. The barracks of the 11th Hussars became a pressure cooker of paranoia and silent rebellion. A suffocating wave of resentment spread through every rank. Officers began whispering in dark corners, rumors of forced resignation spread, and the newspapers continued to report on every development. Cardigan, rather than backing down, doubled down on his behavior, using his authority to wage a personal vendetta against anyone he perceived as disloyal. As if one Reynolds hadn't been enough to push the regiment over the edge, Cardigan soon clashed with another officer sharing the exact same surname. He targeted Captain Richard Reynolds, cornering him over another series of manufactured disciplinary infractions. Cardigan forced Richard Reynolds into a controversial court-martial that eventually saw the proud officer officially cashiered from the army, destroying his livelihood. The internal toxicity grew so severe that the public could no longer look away. A former officer of the regiment, Captain Harvey Tuckett, could no longer stomach the injustice. Writing under a pseudonym, Tuckett published a scathing letter in the Morning Chronicle, exposing Cardigan's relentless bullying of his officers to the entire nation. When Cardigan discovered the writer's true identity, his response was not to seek a military tribunal or a legal remedy. Instead, he chose a path that was archaic, violent, and scandalous. He challenged Captain Tuckett to a duel. On a gray morning on Wimbledon Common, the two men stood face to face with loaded pistols. Cardigan raised his weapon and fired, shooting and seriously wounding Tuckett in the hip. That might not sound shocking today, but in the 1840s this was extraordinary. Dueling between officers had fallen badly out of favor in British society. It was viewed as a barbaric relic of the past, and carried severe legal consequences, including the death penalty if the opponent died. This wasn't just scandalous, it was career-ending territory. At least, it should have been. The public outrage was immediate. Condemnation filled the press, and the affair became a political embarrassment for the government, drawing attention far beyond the military establishment. Cardigan was arrested and forced to stand trial for attempted murder before the highest court in the land, the House of Lords. The trial exposed just how much influence, wealth, and status still carried in Victorian Britain. Cardigan used every single ounce of his wealth and his high society connections to fight the charges. When the verdict was finally delivered, the result left the British public utterly cynical. The House of Lords acquitted Cardigan of all charges on a ridiculous legal technicality. The prosecution had failed to prove the exact, full legal name of Harvey Tuckett as laid out in the official indictment. Many critics believed Britain's aristocratic establishment had protected one of its own. Cardigan walked out of Westminster a free man, his command intact, but his reputation was permanently destroyed. He became deeply unpopular among many officers and critics. The 11th Hussars were now a national laughingstock, the regiment led by a tyrant who fought duels over wine bottles. The scandal faded from the newspapers, but it never truly disappeared. 14 years later, Britain went to war against the Russian Empire in the windswept landscapes of the Crimea. By 1854, the 11th Hussars found themselves stationed on the frozen rocky fields of Balaclava, and commanding them, through sheer political survival, was none other than the aging Lord Cardigan. Years of relentless inspections had produced one of the smartest-looking cavalry regiments in Europe. On the morning of October 25, 1854, their uniforms still looked impeccable, their gold braid catching the stark Crimean sun, and their famous crimson trousers standing out vividly against the bleak, brown earth of the valley. Unfortunately, immaculate appearance possessed zero tactical value against heavy Russian artillery. What happened next would become one of the most infamous military catastrophes in human history. Due to a series of prideful, miscommunicated orders passed between arrogant generals who flat-out refused to cooperate or speak directly to one another, Cardigan received a fatal command. He was ordered to take his lightly armored, vulnerable cavalry brigade and mount a direct, frontal assault into the heart of a narrow valley, a valley that was surrounded on three sides by heavily fortified Russian artillery batteries and infantry. It was a suicide mission. Cardigan, placing his rigid belief in blind obedience above basic survival instinct, did not question the madness of the order. He drew his sword, aligned his men, and gave the command to charge. The bugle sounded, and the 11th Hussars rode directly into the mouth of hell. The charge itself was a waking nightmare of iron and smoke. As the horses accelerated down the valley, the Russian guns opened fire from the ridges, tearing through the ranks with devastating effectiveness. Cannonballs ripped through the horses and men, vaporizing riders in an instant. The first real battle these immaculate uniforms ever faced didn't care how perfectly they were tailored. The crimson trousers that had once been the center of elegant London society gossip and petty barracks inspections were now torn apart by shrapnel, stained with black gunpowder, and soaked in the mud and blood of a slaughterhouse. Yet driven by the sheer muscle memory of years of discipline, the survivors kept their alignment, riding through a gauntlet of fire that shocked the watching world. Within minutes, the regiment that had spent years polishing buttons and perfecting seams had been ripped apart by artillery. The fields grew quiet, the smoke slowly drifted away. Hundreds of men and horses lay scattered across the valley floor. The disaster instantly captured the collective imagination of the British public back home. It was immortalized by Alfred Tennyson in his famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, which, while celebrating the bravery of the common soldiers who rode into the Valley of Death, quietly leveled a critique at the command structure with the haunting phrase, "Someone had blundered." Cardigan himself miraculously survived the carnage, returning from the valley remarkably early and unscathed. It was a decision that only fueled criticism from those who believed he had abandoned his men in the chaos of the retreat to seek the comfort of his private yacht. His reputation never recovered from the shadow of that valley. The trousers that once made London laugh eventually rode into one of Britain's greatest military disasters. The tragedy of the 11th Hussars wasn't just Lord Cardigan. It was a military system where wealth could buy command, appearance often mattered more than experience, and ordinary soldiers paid the price. The public outrage over disasters like Balaclava slowly changed the country. Decades later, Parliament finally abolished the purchase system entirely, establishing a professional army based on merit rather than money. But for the men who rode down that valley, the lesson came too late. The crimson uniforms became the perfect symbol of a broken institution, one that finally collapsed under the guns of Balaclava. Was Lord Cardigan truly the villain of this story? Or was he simply the most visible symptom of a broken military system? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more history. I'll see you in the next chapter.